So this one was on was a study done to look at the difference between well, liberals and conservatives specifically, but just kind of looking in general at the political spectrum and how your political orientation might be influenced by perceived threat or uncertainty avoidance, and just kind of what that implies for those on the political spectrum. So they conducted 3 studies. All of the studies were pretty similar in nature. They were all online studies, and they looked specifically at the issue of immigration. And so kind of looking, since we already know that that's somewhat of a polarized issue in some regard. And then they used the uncertainty avoidance and perceived threat through those lenses to see basically if there was a difference between conservatives and liberals. And so not to go, I guess, too much into detail because they were kind of the same 3 studies, except the third one looked at effect misattribution procedure. They included that instead of just an attitude scale. And then study 2, rather than looking just at immigrants, was focused on an unspecified group. So they kind of see more so how the perceived threat and uncertainty avoidance, if that was the same continually or if it was just this one issue. So now if you can go to the next slide. And so overall, they did notice that conservatives were more likely to have a greater concern for perceived threat and uncertainty avoidance, which in this case resulted in greater negative attitudes toward immigrants than liberals did. And so they kind of suggest that perceived threat and uncertainty avoidance mediate the relationship between political orientation and negative attitudes. They did show that liberals were shown consistently in all 3 studies to be more likely to help immigrants, and that they would be more, or I guess less concerned with them as like a threat per se than conservatives. So overall, there was kind of a leaning that if you have a higher sense of perceived threat and uncertainty avoidance, then you're more likely to be conservative in some regard. And then they used the uncertainty threat model, and that was assessed to be the most accurate throughout all of these studies. But the biggest thing I think, and I like that they brought this up at the end, is that it kind of takes away from some of the previous research that suggests that there's really a negativity bias on behalf of conservatives, and they're looking at it more through the lens of just differences in how people handle threat or perceived threat. And so if you can kind of understand it and take away from some of the negative attitudes, or looking at it as like a dominance or a power struggle, and more so at people are concerned and they feel their well-being or their needs are threatened, and you can address it kind of at that base level, it might open up more opportunity for people to both policy-wise and in general, just kind of bring more unity into play, and find some more moderate ways to handle those things. And so again, the ultimate thing is just that people, or how they respond to threat has more of a say with where they lie on the political spectrum, and then how they may react to those issues.
Yes, it means this sort of like, it's almost like this is one definition of what it means to be a conservative. Is like to feel like I don't want more sort of immigration, or at least illegal immigration or something like that. Like, it's almost like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, if I'm conservative, then I feel this way, but no, I feel this way, which means I'm conservative, kind of thing. You know, it's like a definition of conservatism. And also, I was looking at, so like this was only measuring, it was just only the target of the experiment was just immigration, right?
It was, yeah. So
it's really about perceived threat about immigration, not in general perceived, because you could have another target on the other side for liberals, and there's perceived threats on the liberal side. Just depends on what the target is. You know, they're not afraid of immigration, but they're afraid of other things. You know, like Republicans, like you give them a Republican as a target, and then their perceived threat level goes up, kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think that's an excellent point. There's definitely more ways to look at it and different issues to look at. I know the second study that they did remove the immigration as a factor to see if it was still consistent. And I think they did still show, even in study 2, that overall conservatives were still a little bit more likely to fall higher on that perceived threat and uncertainty avoidance. And that was just a general unspecific outgroup. But I think you're totally right, Jeremy. I mean, I think still, you know, it could also be how they ask the questions or different things. I mean, if you put that in another light, it could be the same on both sides.
Yeah. But, yeah. There's that correlation between conservatism and traditionalism, and traditionalism is certainly more risk averse, you know, more threat averse.
Yeah. It's definitely interesting. And that reminds me, actually, I think one of the like outside articles I tagged in the blog post for this was actually talking about kind of that sense of being risk averse and whether it's more liberals or conservatives. And I think it kind of showed it through a different lens. So I put it in there just to kind of like weigh out the findings. But
yeah, you ever hear of the what's it called? You ever read any Jonathan Haidt? Jonathan Haidt's he's a social psychologist, and he it's called moral foundations theory, and he looks a lot at like how people on the political spectrum, there's like some sort of basic moral categories, and which categories are more important depending on your political spectrum. And where it's like, you know, the category of like care and harm is very important for in terms of morality is very important for liberals, and and fairness is another category. And then on the others, on the conservative side, it's like all of the categories are very like, so like group membership and that kind of stuff, and traditionalism and faith, and, you know, sort of different types of, so they have like different moral structures almost in terms of what defines a conservative versus a liberal. And I remember it being like, it's like very much about, you know, if you're conservative, it's very much about your in group. It's very much about like what's good for us. And it's like if you're on the liberal side, it's more about what's good for everyone, you know, like not just our in group, but other people too. And how do we care for other people? And so it's like this weird sort of conflict of morality almost, like what's moral, what's the highest moral good. I'm probably not doing a good job of explaining that, but.
No, it sounds really interesting. I definitely, like, I know his name. I don't think I've read anything by him, but I am curious about that.
Yeah, the book is really fascinating. A book called The Righteous Mind is a really good book. He kind of goes over that theory in a lot of his research and the research in the field of like morality and like why do people get divided over politics and religion, I think is the subtitle.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, and I like a lot of these studies and kind of some of the findings behind it, which is that there's ways to mediate between these groups and to kind of help level out the polarization, but it really takes an effort from everyone to do that.
Yeah.
Which is hard to do.
What I did hear from Jeremy, just talking about kind of the in-group, out-group, those that maybe fall on the conservative side are more adverse to out-group, or like, you know, more adverse to out-group populations. And it kind of ties into the key takeaway here, reframing it to where it's, you know, it's not so much of the in-group, out-group, but just the uncertainty avoidance and the, you know, perceived threat. So those that fall on the conservative side might just have more of a perceived threat to these out-groups. So I think I like the framing, because it kind of takes away a blame, like as you put here with you know, less specific, you know, of discrimination, and that might level the playing field to where we can talk about these things in a ways where it's not like, oh, well, you're conservative, so you're not open to other groups. It's like, oh, you have more of a, you feel more threatened. Let's talk about that. You know, I like the framing, the reframing of this to being a little bit more welcoming to talk about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Instead of kind of suggesting that, you know, you're ethnocentric because you don't like people of other, you're basically just saying you have a perceived threat about these people or this situation or this theory, that's heightened. And why? Let's talk about the threat perception.
Yeah.
Let's figure out how to mitigate that threat perception. And it's like, no wonder if you're watching certain media that talks about how dangerous immigrants are or immigration or something like that, like, okay, that's why you're feeling so threatened by this idea. Let's figure out how to mitigate the threat. I think that's a much easier sell to people than to say, like, you're this way so you don't like people or you don't like other you know, app group members.
I was going to say, if they already have a higher sense of perceived threat, and then I guess if they feel, you know, then if there's more of like a stigma or different things, I think it pushes them more on that defensive side than they already are.
Yeah.
Because they're already there, right? So you're just kind of like pushing it farther. Yeah, I like what you said, Sarah. I think that's very relevant. And I like this reframing too. I think it gives us an idea of how to potentially respond and try to get people to be more self-reflective, understand why they feel that way.
I think this is relevant for all conflict. Like if you're trying to help people with conflict, it's like, instead of, you're not a bad person, you're not like, you have some uncertainty or mistrust or feeling of threat from this other individual. And that's why you're feeling like, you know, defensive and in conflict. So like, let's try to figure out how to mitigate that perception of threat.
I was just going to ask a clarification. So this was looking at the identifying groups were conservative or liberal, not Democrats. Like it didn't look at Democrats and Republicans, right?
Nope. Yeah, just liberal or conservative. And I think they asked to kind of, I think they did a scale that kind of gauged whether they were like moderate or like where, you know, kind of where they fell on that line. But it was like self-input. I think the people in the study gave their political leanings as part of the demographics.
Okay. The reason I ask is because I think a lot of times lately, I mean, we are associating those words with the political groupings where it's not really that case. Like you can have a liberal, well, you used to, now things are changing a lot in the last like 10 years or so, but you can have there used to be liberal Republicans that were pro-immigration, you know, and pro-immigration reform, and things have like changed a lot. So that kind of ties into the previous study, right, about associations and like how these associations have changed in the political categories over the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah. And it also brings, you know, a heightened awareness too, then, of the role that media is playing in all of this, because you mentioned, you know, like the last 10 to 20 years, but that's really as the media has really heightened so much of this, like them versus us and all of these, you know, headlines and.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everywhere. Yeah.